this year. All right, so let's get started. It's session, one of the international section track sessions on food security targeting. So we're really excited to have some excellent presentations. And so without further ado, I believe the structure of this is speaker discussant, right? Okay.
Sure. 3 speakers in one discussion. Yeah.
Okay, so John's discussing all of them. Goodness.
Exactly.
All right, so thank you all for being here. I'm presenting Optimal Food Security Monitoring. I'm Dana Smith. I'm a current PhD candidate at Cornell in the Applied Economics program, and I'll be presenting joint work with Paul Christian, Brian Dillon, Aaron Wentz, Hope Michelson, and Joanna Upton, looking at optimal food security monitoring, theory and evidence from high-frequency data. So to get started, what we know about food security, or insecurity rather, is that it is dynamic. Households vary throughout the year in terms of their food security status. This might be predictable for reasons such as—
Could you share your screen? I'm sorry to disturb you. Could you please share your screen with us online?
Thank you for interrupting it.
Yeah.
Sorry. Showing the wrong one here. Okay. Is that better? In Zoom, can you see the slides?
Can you see the slides on Zoom?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so as I was saying, food security is dynamic. Households vary over the course of the year. That might be for reasons that are predictable, such as seasonality, but it can also be due to shocks. And this affects even households we would generally classify as food insecure throughout the whole period. They are still relatively dynamic in terms of the severity of the food insecurity they're experiencing. This makes it difficult for observers to distinguish between chronic and acute food security, especially if monitoring is sporadic. We only have measures from one particular moment. Understanding how food security is dynamic helps us think about how we could predict it in the future, which is important for targeting initiatives. If we want to reach the most affected households, then we need to know who they're going to be, and we need to know who they're going to be next month, 2 months, 3 months into the future. And so that's what we're broadly focused on in this work. And it's kind of related to work on resilience, as well as transitory poverty and vulnerability, thinking about who is most likely to need food aid assistance and how do we target it most effectively. So our research questions that I'll be presenting on today are threefold. First, it's a descriptive analysis. We want to discuss how variable food security really is. And we're going to think about specific measures. In this case, we're using the household hunger scale, which is scored from 0 to 6. And so we won't just be classifying a household as a binary insecure or secure. We'll be looking at their actual measure of food security using this metric. The second part of the analysis is theory-based. We're going to think about how to best fit a model that accounts for fixed and stochastic factors that determine food insecurity throughout the year. And then finally, we want to translate this into policy-driven metrics and ideas. How can we use this information, the types of data that are available, to make forecasts that people on the ground could really use to target food aid effectively? So the data we're using comes from the MIRA project, which is measuring resilience in Malawi. This is a high-frequency panel. So they visit 2,250 households in this southwestern Malawi region, 3 districts in the southwest. It's collected every single month. Our baseline was in late 2017, and it's been collected monthly, essentially through mid-2021. Assets, land holdings, livestock, those types of things are collected once per year. And the monthly survey is relatively sparse, but collects information on household food security, as well as general measures of shocks. Self-reported, did you have a shock last month?
How many months?
So in total, we're up to 44. So this is also partnered with Catholic Relief Services and is part of their mission to directly inform the work that they're doing and effectively target their aid. So we came into this with this idea in mind. So looking for research question 1, the descriptives, here are 3 emblematic households from our survey data. So you see on the axis, we've actually flipped it so it's a little easier to understand. The household hunger score, lower numbers mean you are more food secure. So on top, this blue line, we have a household that is almost never food insecure. They score relatively high, but you can see over the course of this approximately 3.5 years, they're moving around quite substantially in terms of their reported food security, according to the HHS. We also have the green household that bounces above and below what we're defining as our binary food secure insecure line. So some households will fully switch. And then even among the poor households or the poorest households in this context, we have the always food insecure households. But again, the severity is quite severe some months, but it does at least marginally improve in others. And those specific values might be worthwhile if we're thinking about food aid targeting. Continuing with the descriptives. So this is, again, we're defining a household hunger score of 3 or less as food secure, just for this particular table. So we have 13% of households that are always food insecure in our data set. Less than 0.5% are never food secure, but 86%, the overwhelming majority, are switching back and forth. They are moving around month to month pretty substantially, which motivates our need to target when we think about what's going to happen next month. Among the people who are switching, we have 11,500 or so total switches. So households can switch more than one time for sure in that 44-month window. When the household hunger score, when food security gets worse, the HHS tends to increase by about 2. When it gets better, it tends to decrease by about 1.6. Somewhat even, moving in both directions, although they tend to be getting worse more often in our particular survey window. And then among the always secure, because this is one of our areas of interest, 21% of the rounds or of the months, households are getting worse. So even though they are still classified as food secure, they might be moving from a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 2. And for about 2% of those rounds, they're actually getting worse twice in a row, continuing. So moving towards the theory, what this is all motivating is this idea that food security status in time period T is a function of your assets, big F, a stochastic shock, E, and period-specific factors that impact the return on those on those assets, such as prices. Approximately linearly, we can say that household food security is a function of assets with the term for their returns and a shock. So let's assume that shocks are serially correlated while assets are a random walk. And if we substitute, gather some terms, we start to get an estimatable looking function that again is taking into account assets now in time period 1, the evolution of assets over time, and the sum, the cumulative impact of recent shocks. So how does this matter for policymakers? So on the left-hand side, your food security is decomposed into initial assets, the orange F, and the innovations since period 1, plus the purple current return on those assets, which depends on the time period of the year and other trends. And then in blue on the end, we have the cumulative effect of recent shocks. We're going to say period 1 is just the last time this particular community was surveyed, when you have the asset data from. So we express this in an estimatable function, which allows us to think of 2 empirical ideas. The first is We can run this regression and vary T, so vary the months in which household hunger is evaluated, and regress that against assets in period 1, and see if that coefficient on those assets changes. Are they changing in how valuable they are for predicting household hunger as you move farther and farther away from when those assets were initially measured? That also motivates descriptively examining whether assets are evolving over time. And with the mirrored data, because once a year they do go back and collect those assets, we can actually see over, we have 4 annual surveys, which I'll show you, to see whether those assets are in fact changing. Generally speaking, this is about asking how quickly does that data on household assets decay in usefulness for predicting current household food security. So the first result that we have here is we use 3 methods to evaluate the impact of baseline assets or period 1 assets on food security over time. So our basic PMT includes things, that's a proxy means test, includes things like number of cell phones, bicycles, tractors, as well as total livestock units, and whether or not they own land. What we're calling the big PMT is we put everything the mirror data collected in there. So that also includes a variety of household characteristics, how they access drinking water, toilet facilities, as well as number of income sources, but not income itself. And so we also use the green triangles are a random forest rather than OLS. And the pattern we sort of see is vaguely wavy, which we think is sort of seasonality coming in, but very interestingly, no substantial decay. So we're evaluating the prediction success using the root mean square error. And so if the predictions were getting worse over time, we should see higher errors in period 39 as opposed to period 1, because all of these are just using baseline assets. So this is much farther from when those assets were collected than period 1. And yet we don't see substantial evolution. In the interest of time, I'm going to go through this one quickly. This is essentially the same idea. We've just translated everything into one asset PCA, an asset index using principal component analysis. And again, we're going to regress them just now during the months of the annual surveys that were collected. This is still just baseline, so period 0 asset index over the annual survey. And we did that to compare it to whether the assets themselves are evolving over time. So one of the reasons we might not see that baseline assets are decaying in usefulness is because it doesn't really seem like the assets are changing, at least over our window. So this is quartiles at baseline, and you can see whether a household was relatively richer or poorer at baseline, assets relatively consistent. We then took this to the IHPS, the Integrated Household Panel Survey in Malawi. So this is a data set from their statistical agency that is, again, a panel where we have assets from 2010, but we can now go 10 years over time because they've collected 2010, 13, 16, and 19. And again, we see a similar pattern, not seeing substantial decay. Which takes us to how valuable is the mirror data in terms of recent household food security measures. So we have last month's actually. And so what we see is 1 month back, regardless of how you measure baseline, assets, 1 month back is very valuable in terms of reducing prediction error. We get much more accurate results. But around 6 months, they start to become less valuable. 6 months and 7 months, you're going to get a pretty similar prediction, whether you have that 6 month or that 7 month out actual measure of food security. So far, what we've shown is that if you have a proxy for fixed assets and lagged measures of food insecurity, quite a lot of them, you can do pretty well in terms of targeting 1 month into the future, 2 months into the future. But policymakers may not have access to that data, certainly not that high frequency of data. So now we're going to think about what could they have instead, including weather data, as well as single observations of asset data or past measures. So the first thing to show you is, again, we have the RMSC on the left-hand side. Higher values are less valuable or less good predictions. So just having baseline data is about equivalent to having actual food security measure from 5 to 6 months ago in terms of prediction error. In terms of overall, it tends to have similar prediction error. Weather data, especially using machine learning techniques, does do better, and this is weather data alone. We use the CHIRPS satellite data set, so does do pretty well, but it takes substantial data to do these predictions, which could be data heavy for an organization that needs to work quickly. Having 1 month out food security alone, just last month, very valuable, might be very costly to collect because you need to know when you're going to distribute the food, and bureaucracies and holdups make that very difficult. And so finally, this is just a summary of all of our results. So these hollow shapes are what you saw earlier. No weather, just a baseline asset proxy of some kind, and all 12 at a time past lagged measures. Weather and the filled in shapes systematically improves predictions. This is always helpful at every level. And then I want to call your attention to these green arrows. So the green arrows are if you just had the fixed component proxy, if you just had those baseline assets and weather, you basically do about as well as if you had no weather, but 2 months ago, an actual observation. So in terms of policymakers making trade-offs for what data they need to make that prediction 2-3 months in the future, we're hoping something like this can inform them. And so those were, I'll go back, we have time. So broadly, our conclusions are that food security is quite variable in our survey, even among households that would be generally classified as food insecure or secure. Assets from one period in the past, potentially even as far as from 10 years ago, do a pretty good job, at least in our context in Malawi, at predicting that fixed component of household food insecurity over time. But in terms of the trade-offs and what's valuable, that recent food security measure is very valuable, but it might be very costly to collect. We are hoping that in using our results, we can think about the trade-offs or evaluate the trade-offs that a policymaker might need to make on the ground. Which brings us to our next steps in ongoing work. So far we've only evaluated models by RMSC, which hides a lot of important variation. For example, someone might care about predicting a food insecure household is actually secure more than the other way around. Essentially, type 1 and type 2 error might value in different ways, depending on what your goals and objectives are, like who you are, what you're trying to accomplish. It also might be something like if CRS wants to deliver food to everyone who has a HHS score over 2, well, whether we predict a 4 and someone's actually a 6 is kind of fine, but if we predict a 1 and someone's actually a 3, that's a problem. So where we're going next is sort of thinking about evaluation criteria and how we weight the different errors in a policy relevant context. Thank you.
Oh, you want to do Q&A before discussion?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so John's just the overall. I got it. Okay, go ahead.
I'm curious about, you mentioned the weather variables included in your analysis.
So since we have the monthly data, what we did was we took 1 year prior from that month. So if a household was observed in December of 2020, then we would include dry days and total rain in pentads, so in 5-day periods, going back a full 12 months. And so each observation, as the observation moves to January, then the weather data that's associated with that observation sort of shifts forward 1 month. So it's always 12 months back from the household security measure.
So even if the observation is like a non-rainfall, so capturing the rain, the non-rainfall period.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah.
Couple of questions. As a robust track, can we try using or have access to any data set with lights?
With
fives, the food insecurity experience?
So we've tried it with not just the HHS as the food insecurity measure. With our data, we can only construct the HHS and the reduced coping strategies index.
Because as a robust track for type 1 and type 2, I think that is hugely important that you're comparing them to other, not just HHS.
Right, yeah.
Second, field spotted on USDA economic issues. From an operational point of view, you know, even fives is extremely expensive. Data you're showing from CRS, I don't know what much money they spent doing the survey. Very expensive.
Yep.
WFP does not, you know, that's why we've invented international phase classification system, which is very criticized because, you know, there's a lot of biases. Second, sometimes I don't need glasses to see what's in front of me. So if I'm in the Sahel, you know, Mali, Senegal, I know 3 months before the harvest, there's going to be huge food insecurity. So how would you sell it to a policymaker to do these huge investments? What is the advantage of this relative to the system that we already spend millions, if not billions of dollars to implement? So
our hope is that we're actually going to be able to suggest, by doing an optimal monitoring strategy, a money-saving technique. You don't have to go. What we've actually shown is you don't have to go every month for 12 months. The mirror collection is very high frequency, and those 12 months measures don't offer us a ton. So what we're trying to offer someone would be, think about your organization's resources, what kind of time, what kind of money and data you have access to, and then look at our results and think about what combination of options is most cost effective and gets you the best prediction that you can do. So when we added the weather data, which is easily accessible from a sort of data availability perspective, the idea was exactly that. Instead of needing to go on the ground and talk to people, how valuable is it to have one baseline asset survey that you did once and could be used for many organizations in many contexts, and then adding weather data. And so we're trying to actually create exactly the solution you're kind of talking about, is what's the most cost-effective way to do monitoring, because it is so expensive to go very, very frequently, as they have done in MIRA.
Right, because remote sensing data, I'm sorry, the last comment I'll make, you know, as someone who used to monitor food insecurity for the local information early warning system, we use remote sensing data all the time to figure out where crops were going to fail, to come up with our balance sheets, to figure out where food was going to be needed. So I agree with you 100% that that may be a very cost-effective way of going.
Thank you.
Maybe one more quick.
Lauren Rush, University of Arizona. I was curious, did you look into varying the different remote weather sensing systems? Because I know that there's a significant variation.
Yeah, so fantastic question. So right now, no, we've just stuck with chirps because we were doing it. One of the things we have started to play around with is sort of how much we throw at the model. So using dry days and total rain in pentads for a whole year is a substantial amount of data, and a lot of it is probably predictively useless, but we had it, so we did it. But we can do, we've thought about, you know, do we just want standard deviations from long-term norms during the growing season, things like that. So that's like on the horizon in terms of cost effectiveness and data and quality and all that. Thank you.
Already load yours up. Let's see. Okay, so chat.
Yeah. All right, can folks see those slides?
Yes, yes, we can see.
Thanks, Dave, appreciate it.
Right.
So hi, my name is Kathy Bayless. This is work with Chungmin Manny Kim, who's in the audience. So any hard questions go to him. And then also with Aaron Lentz and Hope Michelson. And let me try and move. Sorry, there we go. All right. So what we're going to try and do is basically do a deep-ish dive, maybe a shallowish dive into looking at what the different food security measures actually capture. And this all came out of work. I'm going to risk taking off that off just so I'm not mumbling quite as much. This all came out of work from earlier work where we were doing models like the ones that Dana presented, trying to predict food insecurity using a bunch of remotely sensed weather data, some prices, et cetera, et cetera. And then we suddenly were scratching our heads a little bit in terms of wondering what were we actually predicting. So up until that point, we were really looking at things like reduced coping strategies index and household dietary diversity, FCS stuff. And we were getting encouragement to look at things like the IPC. Anyway, this has sort of caused us to wonder, okay, well, if we are seeing differences in our predictions of these different food security measures, what's actually going on, who are we capturing? And fundamentally, it sort of raises this question of how do we measure food insecurity, and what are these different measures actually capturing? Are they capturing the same people, different people? If they're capturing the same people, yay, this is wonderful, makes targeting a lot easier. If each of these measures are capturing slightly different groups of people, that's probably something worth knowing. Do we want to try and target the intersection? Do we want to target the union? Or if we target using one metric versus another, who are we missing? Who are we including? That kinds of stuff. So that's basically what we're going to try to do here, is just to sort of do a deep data dive. So this is basically summary stats on steroids of a bunch of data, just looking at correlations between these food security indices, and then trying to look at the characteristics of the households that fall in these different categories. So fundamentally, we're trying to do different food security measures, identify different groups of people, and is there if they are capturing different people, is there information in that? So what I'm going to start off by doing is just doing some quick sort of summary, showing you some quick summary stats in terms of overlap between food consumption score, reduced coping strategies index, and also just sort of a straight up kind of asset index, which you could imagine being used also for targeting. Then we're going to try and look at sort of, again, what aspects each of these measures are capturing. And then we're going to do a little bit of comparison with the IPC and try to see which of these metrics is the IPC capturing, et cetera. We're going to do this using the LSMS data. We've got LSMS, we've got it for many countries. The countries that we're using, we wanted to use because they had multiple waves and they also overlapped with the IPC. So we're using Malawi, the 3 waves in Malawi, the three waves in Ethiopia, and 2 waves in Nigeria. We're gonna focus in on the rural population, partially because we were finding some pretty funky stuff in I know there's different ways of measuring assets for rural versus urban populations. We also wanted to kind of look at populations where maybe some of the weather variables were maybe a little more predictable, et cetera, and maybe we're a little more comparable across countries. So, and anyway, just a limitation of where we started from as we're looking at rural populations here. We linked all of those clusters in the LSMS to sort of the nearest set of market prices. And then again, we overlay all of these with the IPC, not the predictions, but the contemporaneous measures of food security from the IPC. And then we also, like everybody else, use some weather data from our colleagues at the Climate Hazard Center. So just to give you a sense of the kind of data we're using, this is the setting for, these are the numbers for Malawi over the 3 different waves. So we look at sort of the percent that fall under that are defined as asset poor over the 3 countries. So we're just kind of, we create an asset index over all 3 countries and say, all right, let's just take the bottom 30% and we're going to define those folks as asset poor. Then we've used sort of the binary measure of food insecurity for the RCSI, sort of using a measure of RCSI sort of it's greater than 19. So if RCSI is one of those measures, right, that gets worse as you go higher. That's a number of coping strategies essentially you're taking. We also use sort of a standard cutoff for the region for food insecurity from the food consumption score. And take-home message from this table that has too many numbers is that you might see that there's not gobs of overlap. Show that visually, we did a Venn diagram. And so what's kind of particularly striking to me was even though about a little over 11% of the folks were food insecure as defined by the RCSI, only 0.8% are actually defined as food insecure as using all of our 3 metrics here. So if you're saying, well, the asset index is maybe questionable, it's sort of really, it isn't capturing food insecurity, it's capturing something else. Also notice that just the overlap between the RCSI and the FCS is not particularly high. Right, so it's only about 1.3% compared to, again, about 11% total number of folks in the RCSI. So it's a small fraction of folks who are measured as food insecure under the RCSI that are also food insecure using the FCS. We do this also for Ethiopia and rural Nigeria. And basically punchline is we're finding similar kinds of patterns, just not that much overlap. Then we do this in 3D. So if you're worried that maybe we're capturing sort of weirdness around the cutoffs, that maybe it's like we have a whole bunch of people clustered right above sort of that 21 threshold, right, right above or below the thresholds, and that's what's going on. The quick answer is no. And I realize that's sort of an ugly diagram, but basically we're seeing lots of heterogeneity. There's a pretty wide distribution across these measures. So there we've got kind of FCS, and I don't know if that's a Z axis, or RCSI maybe on the X, and the asset index on the vertical. You'll also notice that there are some folks that are listed as FCS poor that have some pretty high number of assets, same as sort of some of the blue dots, the RCS light blue dots of food insecure folks that have a fair number of fairly high assets. And that's a pattern I want to come back to. So it's intriguing. And again, we're not trying to explain anything. We're just trying to say, let's throw all the data on the table and see what we see. Similar kinds of patterns in terms of lots of heterogeneity in terms of what we're seeing in Ethiopia and Nigeria. I should note what we're doing here is that we're looking at individual households in the same time frame. So again, we're not comparing across households, we're not comparing across time. It's just like for a household today, what are their assets? What is their RCSI measure? What's their FCS measure? This made us feel a little better about the assets. I mean, Dana's presentation made me feel even better about asset measures. So this is good. Is that we've then just sort of looked at the distribution of FCS. This is again, just for Malawi for ease of interpretation, where we're kind of comparing the bottom 30% to the top 30% and looking at their distribution of FCS. And it's shifting in the right direction, which is good, right? So wealthier people on average, their distribution of FCS is shifted to the right. So they are more food insecure on average, but again, there's a fair bit of overlap. RCSI, again, the numbers are going the opposite direction in that higher RCSI is worse. And again, you do see that sort of poor people are more likely to have higher RCSIs. So this is comforting in that wealth is definitely picking up some signal. The only point, I guess, is that there's also a lot of noise. So let me explain these figures. So here we have RCSI is on the horizontal axis, FCS measures are on the vertical axis. So if everybody was perfectly aligned, here, under both measures, we'd see a nice diagonal. We'd see everybody clustered along that diagonal, right? High FCS should be linked to a low RCSI, et cetera. The colors are their asset measures, and they're just two different ways of measuring assets. This is the asset index is a continuous measure. This is our discrete measure of whether they fall in that lower 30% or not. And it's basically percent of people living in that cluster. What you can see is that there are some dark blocks in this picture, light blocks in that picture so people, locations and households that seem to have relatively high assets that seem to also have pretty high RCSI. And in particular, so that means they're pretty insecure using RCSI as a measure, but they're actually, again, have a fair number of assets. Noticeably, a lot of that also seems to be happening in places that have, with folks that also have, so relatively high FCS. So FCS, they look food secure. RCSI, they look food insecure, and they also are relatively wealthy, at least on an asset level. This is trying to foreshadow sort of some of the punchline, but let me just jump straight to it. Is that so? What we seem to be picking up is that RCSI is better at picking up shorter run movements in food insecurity, or at least what we're seeing is consistent with the fact that RCSI might be better at picking up shorter run movements in food insecurity, whereas FCS, which is capturing basically a form of dietary diversity, is better at capturing longer run movements. Again, similar pattern, Ethia. Oops, why is that not skipping? All right, so next thing we do is, just, again, dead bog simple, just running a multinomial logit, trying to figure out what characteristics are associated with these different categories. And so the base here are people that are not food insecure by either measure. But then we look at sort of people that are, compared to those folks, what are the characteristics associated with people who are FCS insecure only, RCSI food insecure only, or both. One thing to notice is that assets seem to be playing a reasonable role here, despite the fact we know that there's a bunch of outliers there. If you've got lower assets in general, you tend to land in this category or the FCS category. So strongest measure signal of assets is that you may be both. Slightly less signal puts you in FCS, whereas RCSI assets are definitely a predictor, but not as strong a predictor as either of those other two categories. Geography matters, maize prices matter a little bit, but in weird ways. So right now, this is monthly coded data. So maize price from last month, 3 months ago, 6 months ago. There's some evidence that recent maize prices, so from last month, higher maize prices are going to put you in either FCS plus RCSI food insecure or RCSI food insecure, but they don't seem to be giving us much oomph in terms of FCS. Similar kind of thing in terms of, so weather shocks here matter also in ways that are a little bit counterintuitive. So let me walk you through that. So what we're seeing here is that weather patterns right now, what we're seeing is hotter temperatures, wetter temperatures during the last agricultural season, the most recent agricultural season, are basically making you less likely to be only FCS food insecure. They're sort of correlated in a way that makes sense. So hotter temperatures are more likely to make you RCSI food insecure. Lower precipitation, well, I should say lower precipitation overall is making you more food insecure regardless of the metric. But so weather patterns are definitely picking up stuff. There's, I think, the fact that, well, let me stop there. So all of these measures are picking up some metrics associated with the last weather that affected the last harvest. Prices, again, seem to be more linked with being RCSI, food insecure, which might make sense given what we're finding in the assets. So even for a given level, even for higher level of wealth, if you have a big shock in prices, maybe that's enough to push you over to being RCSI food insecure. We'll skip, we did the same thing for the other two countries. Mostly, again, we're finding similar kinds of things that the assets are making some sense. Let me just stop there. Oops. Sorry, the skip. Next thing, and I want to just make sure we leave enough time to talk about the IPC here, is that what we then did was just sort of ask, okay, given we're seeing these different groups being captured by these different measures, what groups is the IPC capturing? And so just to walk this through, this is the example for Malawi, and this is phase 1, 2, and 3, where phase 1 is associated with sort of that area, that IPC zone being on average sort of relatively minimally food stressed versus somewhat food stressed versus in crisis. In Malawi, during this time, we didn't have either the IPC 4 or 5. Okay, so given that the whole point of the IPC is to characterize a zone, you would expect that within that zone, even if they say there's very little food stress, there's going to be some food insecure households. So that's not surprising. But what we would expect, though, is as you get up to areas classified as IPC zone 3, that you would see a higher fraction, specifically about 20% or more of the households classified as being food insecure. And what's notable here is that we see that pattern with the RCSI, particularly in the last wave. So I should note this is the 2010, 2013, 2016 wave. So particularly in 2016, we're seeing that the IPC is capturing stuff that makes sense in terms of the RCSI. It's not picking up much in terms of the FCS. Difference between the top row and the bottom row is this is again these are the folks that are only classified as food insecure using one metric or the other. Sorry, wrong way around. These are the folks characterized as being food insecure using the FC test. All the folks characterized as food insecure using RCSI. This is the folks characterized as RCSI, but not FCS, and vice versa. So notably that, again, even if we strip out the folks that were characterized as food insecure using the FCS, the IPC is doing a good job of picking up RCSI. Last, sorry, I know this is like death by figure, but last one is that we've got, so this is back to that earlier graph that was sort of looking at how the distribution of these metrics change as when we compare low wealth to high wealth households. Same pattern as we saw before, but what's noticeable here is that those distributions seem to get closer together when we get to the IPC3. Right, so and at least when we're looking, if you squint, at least when we're looking at measures of FCS. Flip side for the RCSI, there you actually see a bit more separation of those two wealth groups when people are in an IPC3 zone, and those again, those are the folks that those are folks living in areas that are currently designated as being food stressed. So. Conclusion. We're seeing a fair bit of discord amongst these different measures. I mean, and maybe that's probably not a surprise to folks in this room. It was the degree of discord, frankly, was a surprise to me. In as much as we're seeing patterns in who's being predicted by what, it seems to be that the FCS is more sensitive to assets, versus the RCSI is more sensitive to price changes. Right, and which is maybe suggestive that the FCS is capturing sort of longer run possible measures of vulnerability, which kind of makes sense, versus that the RCSI is capturing is more movement, more shorter run shocks, which to give the IPC points, I mean, that's exactly the folks that they're trying to capture. They're not trying to capture necessarily the chronically insecure, as I understand it. So I think that's a little different from the usual way we think of these metrics, which is that the RCSI captures sort of quantity of food versus FCS capturing the quality of food. I mean, I think they're capturing aspects of that too, but they do, there is sort of a story here in and amongst the dynamics. All in all, this I think just raises this question of thinking through well, firstly, it points to the challenge that the folks who do the IPC have in terms of you trying to capture this multidimensional thing using a consistent metric that is comparable across countries, and gee, it looks like that's hard. Not a shocker, perhaps, right? But it also I think makes me really want to kind of poke a bit more at sort of these metrics, and ideally, can we only use these for now because these are the ones we had in those LSMS surveys, but to actually to start looking at some of the other metrics like the HHS and the fees ones. Anyway, I went over time. Thank you.
Yeah, so that is interesting, and as you say, not terribly surprising, but at the same time, it sort of creates a space where you scratch your head a bit and wonder. But the question I had, and your conclusion slide starts to give this a little bit, is that there's multiple forms of heterogeneity that we can sort of think about trying to unpack. Yep. You mentioned some of them along the way, but one form that I'm sort of intrigued by is sort of heterogeneity in the endogenous responses of these households.
Right.
Because household responses are the household responses to things like crisis, or household responses to weather shocks or something, are going to be quite heterogeneous. So in some sense, like once you allow for that, once you allow for these kind of endogenous household decisions, then it's almost like these groups that you're identifying, it's almost as if households are sort of choosing which group they're in based on these endogenous asset and consumption choices they're making, right? And so the work that sort of teases apart asset smoothing and consumption smoothing suggests that like some households will willingly destabilize consumption in order to preserve assets. So like, but I'm just wondering, so that's complicated, right? And but I do wonder if maybe that means that one thing that might be clarifying is to do some kind of Monte Carlo simulation kinds of things where you generate thousands of households and you generate the data, and then you know exactly what the distribution, the kind of variation in the assets is. But you generate all the variables you need to create these things, and then you just start introducing like some well-known endogenous response patterns, right? So you say, okay, these households are going to do this, these households, and just kind of like play around in the sandbox a bit and say, you know, do you get a bigger wedge between these measures when you introduce an endogenous response at the household level? And if so, like from that, do you learn something about what these measures might be picking up in terms of heterogeneity and response?
I like that idea a lot. I also, I mean, there's going to be heterogeneity in response by choice, obviously, but also by just what outside options different households have. And I think, I mean, firstly, that's a great idea. I really like that. I'm also thinking about how to get it sort of, again, who's constrained versus not in terms of some of those options. I mean, one thing we haven't exploited yet, and we mean to, is the fact that a bunch of, probably everybody in this room knows, a bunch of these data are panel data. And so we could actually, at least for relatively short panels, try to see if we actually see stuff consistent with sort of drawdown of assets by some households and not others. Like, so it could actually allow us to play in the sandbox, but then kind of throw some data at it and see like how well is that parsing out in amongst the dynamics of those households. So I think that could be really cool. But I would also like to try and figure out like whether it's a question of dropping people into livelihood zones or whatever, to also try to figure out what some measures of possible constraints to tease that out. No, thank you though. That's a great thought. Yeah, please.
Second, I want to say congratulations for being brave enough and dumping right into this problem. This discord among leaders is concerning to us. So I lead ERS's team that puts together the food security system. When we're briefing our policymakers, I get two questions. The first question is, how many people are gonna be hungry? Where do I need to send the food?
Yep.
They can care less about the number.
Yep.
Second question I get. Why is your number different than WFP? Why is it different than FAO? Why is USAID telling me this? So, how does this help?
No, that's,
Because the
Yeah.
solution up to now, and we fall in this bucket too. Let's change our model, let's look for new data, more data, more data. But I'm talking to my colleagues at FAO, they're frustrated. Sometimes they put us in a corner, sometimes we put them in a corner. Thoughts?
no, you're, so if again, nobody's with the press, right? No, you just, and you're absolutely right. And I know Aaron, who's a co-author on this, and Dan Maxwell have also done a bunch of work and if talking with stakeholders, and then often they report issues of data confusion for exactly that reason. They're getting told different things by different agencies. They don't quite, I mean, so firstly, I think there needs to be a lot of work done trying to involve some of the stakeholders in thinking through these models and ideally making them iterative so that, you know, if we spit out stuff that's garbage, at least they have some folks who can say, hey, wait, okay, we think you've missed this pest outbreak, right, in your model or whatever. So, you know, at least at the slightly lower level, not maybe probably the top policymakers, but trying to iteratively tweak these models partially to get buy-in also from folks, and so that we're spitting out information that's actually useful for them in decision making. The whole data confusion, competing numbers thing is really tricky, and I totally grant that point. I mean, we work with the Climate Hazard Center, who works with USAID, and I know something that they're very worried about. Yeah, is that you don't want policymakers to throw their hands up in the air and go, up. Well, can't believe any of it, moving right along. And that's actually, I think, one thing the IPC deserves credit for was trying to come up with a system that's harmonized, that also tries to get stakeholders of engagement in it, et cetera. I think this is stuff for pointy-headed academics trying to understand, okay, right, what is this actually doing? And then, so hopefully later feed into future iterations. I don't know if that's good enough.
That's helpful. It's a question I deal with.
All right, probably.
Move on to the next presentation. Hopefully at the end, since there's a discussion at the end, but maybe we'll be able to have some final questions. Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. So yeah, pleasure to be here. These three actually are linked pretty closely, although you'll see here we're gonna be pushing sort of in a similar direction, these questions about like, what do you do when you don't have a lot of data, or is there a more cost-effective way to think about measuring these things? And so we'll be pushing to cell phone detail or call detail records, cell phone data, as a potential source of cheap data with high resolution. I'm filling in for Oscar, who's at the World Bank. He couldn't make it, but I'm happy to be here. And you see the other Josh at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, and Dan Putman, who's at UPenn as co-authors on this. Okay, so the question that we address, we actually ask. We're sort of addressing a broader set of questions in a way, but these food security, like measuring food security, will come up in a very direct way along that path. So the broad question that we're asking is whether cell phone data can inform an aid program. You can think of a lot of ways in which this question might be relevant. And in fact, in the context, we're going to be in Haiti. In Haiti, it's one we've been working closely with the main cell phone company, the mobile network operator there for many years. And they get lots of requests to disperse cash transfers by mobile money. And so they're building this. They actually see this as like a future of their business services, is that when someone comes wanting to NGOs and World Food Program, when someone wants to blast out a bunch of cash to recipients, that they can offer a service, which is like, we can help you target the poor. We can help you figure out who to target using their call record. So there's a lot of reasons why this question might be interesting. Some of them academic and some of them a little bit more practical. It's really, the question is motivated by this general observation in the literature, this from Rwanda, based on work that Josh has done, that suggests that these call detail records, these CDRs thrown at machine learning algorithms, can actually do a pretty good job predicting wealth levels. So we're going to take this as given, that there's something about the way people are using their phone that actually reveals quite a lot about their wealth. And that those digital signatures sort of suggest that information content might actually also help us to predict things beyond wealth, right? That you might be able to characterize at finer, at sort of higher resolution, be able to characterize what's going on in these households. So our context, as I mentioned, is in Haiti. It's a World Food Program emergency cash transfer called EMOP. That was the program, so I'll refer to it as EMOP. I'll talk a little bit more about the targeting, but in this case, the targeting was sort of off-the-shelf World Food Program. So this is like tiers of targeting, but it's just like the way they target, and then we're sort of trying to fit into what they're doing and inform and basically ask and answer that question in the context of an actual aid program with actual targeting per the WFP. And this was in response to a multi-year drought, and so the target, the objective was really food consumption, food security. So what we do is we run a couple of different surveys: an in-person survey, a phone survey. We have another nationally represented survey, and then we match those all to the call records. And so that allows us to toggle between different sources of data for the same people and try to figure out, and it allows us then crucially to train a machine learning algorithm to predict these different outcomes, right? So we can kind of predict out of sample and cross-validate. So the specific pieces that we're going to ask, there's three questions that we're going to ask that fall under this broad question, which are: first, can we use the cell phone data to replicate the targeting of the program, this kind of standard WFP targeting protocol? Second, can we use those call records to predict the outcomes of interest? As I said, sort of taken as given that we can predict wealth levels. And then third, can we use the cell phone records to replicate the actual impact evaluation, the impact results, like the impact of the cash transfer? Okay, so that's obviously the highest, that's the highest bar of the three. And if we can't do those things, why not? So you'll see the last few minutes will all be a postmortem, where we'll say, like, why does it fall flat? Where do the problems creep in? So what we first thing to note is that we can, somewhat like the Rwanda work by Josh and colleagues, we can, using nationally representative survey data and these call records, we actually do a pretty good job predicting wealth levels. So this is a wealth index prediction. You get a cross-validated R-square of about 0.3. Not great, but actually best case in Rwanda, for example, this was maybe 0.45, 0.5. So you can definitely extract information using the nationally representative survey and a wealth index. So the question so that sort of establishes that first point. The question that we're asking then is, if you're trying to use these call records, the source of high resolution data, in a much more targeted program, what kind of problems do you encounter? Okay. So here's now a little bit more about the WFP targeting protocol in the context of EMOP. So this is, as I said, off the shelf. This is how they target a lot of their programs. In fact, we're working with WFP right now. They're planning another one. And this next time, it's actually kind of nice because it gives us an opportunity to be at the table early on, and we can talk about how we can test targeting, that's different than the off-the-shelf targeting that they use. The way their standard targeting is say two stage. Like, so the first stage is identifying the poor rural areas. The map of Haiti at the bottom, in the bottom corner, shows at the time that they were targeting, it shows in dark orange the communes that were most directly affected by this multi-year drought. So essentially they looked at those, they excluded places that were already part of a program, and then they selected those communes and went in and did a scorecard survey. So the scorecard survey is the second stage. Scorecard survey allowed them to very simple, like 8 questions, again, standard WFP stuff. 8 questions, and then based on that, they rank the households, and then based on that, they draw a cutoff, and that determines beneficiaries in these selected communes. Once they target the beneficiaries, then what they get 3 months worth of about $50 transfers that are transferred through mobile money. These are pretty big transfers for these households. So this is a serious cash transfer program. What we can do, what it allows us to do, is then use conventional impact evaluation, RDD, with these vulnerability scores, and I'll show that in a bit. In addition to their scorecard survey, we have 2 other sources of data that we're going to use here. One is an in-person survey that we led, and then the other actually is a phone survey that I'm not going to talk about here. So we'll be mainly using the in-person survey, in addition to the scorecard and the CDRs. I'll skip the descriptive statistics just for the sake of time. So first question is, can these CDRs help to inform targeting? So the way we're gonna frame that question is, we're gonna take the vulnerability index that's based on the scorecard survey as our ground truth data. And so essentially what that means is that we're taking eligibility for EMOP as defined by WFP as a binary vulnerability classification. And then we're just going to see how well we can predict, how well we can classify households using machine learning against these call detail records. And what we find is not at all encouraging. And so this shows you area under the curve results from different ways of a lot of different ways of thinking about dicing up the call detail records, and they're all about random, right? The area under the curve here is all about 0.5. I will say, and this gets to something that Dana raised in terms of the timing. So one of the kind of intriguing things, it doesn't turn out to matter here, but it could in some context, is how over how long do you, like, what is the window for the call detail records that you choose to represent a food security outcome or a vulnerability outcome in a given period? So we're going back in time. So it's like how many days, months, or weeks before the scorecard was conducted, how much further before that do we go to kind of define the data we're using from the call detail records. So not great there, and I'll come back to that in the post in the postmortem. So can these CDRs predict program outcomes? Here, the outcome of interest is food expenditure. So we get that in the in-person survey, and what we see here, these are now correlation cross-validated correlation coefficients. Again, not really able to do very much at all here. And And you can see that graphically, these are basically no predictive content. It's really hard to extract much information from the call detail records. Right, so keep that in mind. We'll come back to that also as a postmortem reflection. As far as the program, as far as the impact of the program, it's actually nice that we have a benchmark here that's useful, because the RDD results, the conventional impact evaluation, suggests that it did work. So in this table, these columns are from the RDD using the survey results. You see that we see that the program actually did improve food consumption. It increased food expenditure. We actually do have a lot of other measures that we haven't included, but for this presentation, it might have been interesting. But there's movement in all of them in the conventional RDD. Not too surprising, because this is a big cash transfer. This is a big relative to household income. But once we get to predicted values, we don't see anything. Now that's not a surprise now, because I already showed you that we have no predictive ability when it comes to food consumption and food expenditure. Okay, so this is just sort of a summary of what we learned. This will set me up to just spend the last few minutes talking through these key limitations. So the first thing that seems pretty clear is that assets are a lot easier to predict than consumption. So that also we set out thinking that's probably the case, the difference between a stock and a flow, and systematic differences by cell phone ownership, and sort of who owns the phones that are generating the data. It actually goes a little bit deeper than that, because it's not just about who owns the phones, it's how they use the phones. So for example, in very poor, vulnerable households, you're more likely to have shared phones. And it's not clear what shared phone ownership and usage does to these call detail records, right? So so that's an open question that probably needs to be studied a little bit more specifically. The third one is that effective targeting makes classification harder, because they took their classification off the shelf, or their targeting. The better they target, the harder it is for us to classify, because we get a narrower and narrower range we get less and less variability in the data with which to train the models, right? So that sort of sets up this fourth one, which is that there's sort of this somewhat disturbing tension between how these algorithms work and how you train them and build them, and what we look for when we're looking for causal identification. So the RDD is great for causal identification. It's terrible for algorithmic training, right? Terrible, because the whole assumption of RDD is that you're close enough that the variation is, and that's not what you need. What you need is a lot of variation in the context of predictions. So let me just hit. I think I just want to do. So this is just showing you that point. This is back to the nationally representative sample. This is what I showed you before. Cross-validated R-square, validated R-square point through. This is what it looks like in the same survey with food expenditure. This is just emphasizing that there's something really hard about flow variables relative to assets. This is the difference in asset or in phone ownership, right? So those that don't have cell phones tend to be much poorer than those who have them. You could predict that. As I said, there's more going on here that's interesting, because those who don't own a phone often use a phone because they share that with another household. So that you get these kind of sharing patterns. And then this effective targeting problem, we actually in the paper, one of the things we can do is we can create artificial eligibility thresholds in the wealth index. And we can just say, like, for a given binary threshold, how well can we predict the households that are on either side, classify the households on either side. And this is just showing you, this is like, the RDD tells us we want to get this window that's really close to the cutoff so that they're qualitatively similar. This is saying that's, you need the opposite for good prediction in the algorithm. You need to be the further away you are, the better the classification. Again, that's a pretty obvious thing until you start going through it and you realize just how much tension there might be between these things. That's the tension I mentioned between causal identification. Okay, so let me just end with this. So current targeting requires a lot of data collection. There is, I think, a lot of promise still in this context, and this is what we're hoping to do next with World Food Program. We would love to be able to actually target, to begin with targeting, because I think targeting at the national level, you actually have some, you can get a lot of purchase in the data. Once they've targeted and they've narrowed down the communes and the poor households within the communes, there's just not a lot of variation there with which to train the data, and so you don't get a lot of traction. So I'll end there.
Questions?
Sure.
So can you just, can you track the same cell phone owner over time?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, so the data now, we have that data. Now it's running on like 4 years of the full call detail records for everyone who has a subscription through this major network operator. So the data, and now the data flows on, we get that, it's there. There's just incredible like information there. And so you can do a lot with mobility. You can do a lot with like civil unrest and how things change. We're doing some stuff on network usage. I think this next thing, if we manage to collaborate with WFP on this next project, I think as I said, if we start at the outset thinking about how can you leverage this source of data in an aid program, I think there's a lot more we could do, right? Because you can actually inform the targeting. You could do a lot of the early stage targeting work, and then you could actually do the horse race that would be interesting to run is between a CDR based targeting and the standard WFP targeting, and that I think would be interesting because that's actually where you have the most variation. That's more interesting than coming in after they've identified the poor households, and then at that point the RDD makes a lot of sense, but the algorithm doesn't.
So you've got, I mean, do you see any signal of the drug whatsoever in terms of the cell phone records, as opposed to like the treatment of the program?
Yeah.
I just wonder, even as a base
So
level.
what we do, I don't know that we've looked at, I don't think we've looked quite that specifically at local drought, but it actually is a good idea. I mean, one of the things we can do that's even easier than that is to say, do you see, it's not in the slides, but it's in the paper, is do you see the date that the cash transfer is sent? Do you see a change in, can you basically look at CDRs and predict when they receive the cash transfer? That easy peasy, right? It's so easy to see that because like everything in how they use the phone changes on the day they receive it. So there's a lot going on. It is moving the needle. It just doesn't push through to the point that you can pick up, given all the other sources of noise in food consumption, that you can pick up those kind of more subtle changes. Yeah.
Have you looked, because you brought up a very important point, the targeting data and the targeting methods of WFP. Maybe you have such large populations of chronically insecure people that may be receiving food aid from WFP in the last 5, 6, 7 years. So going back to your issue of heterogeneity, finding enough heterogeneity.
Yeah.
Have you just even peruse what they have to see?
So we haven't in this context, but again, if we get a round 2 engagement with them on this, which we're hoping to, that's where it would start, right? So that's what we would like to be able to do. There actually is a lot of variation in rural Haiti, but the variation comes from sort of somewhat artificial sources, in part remittances, right? Because it depends a lot on whether you have a household, member who's in Boston. Sorry.
We're gonna go to the discussing. But then hopefully we might have a little more time. So, John, do you have slides you want to share, or?
Hey, Ben, I don't have any slides. I was just going to talk. Is that okay?
That's great. Makes things easier on our end.
Yeah, I gathered that would probably be a desirable attribute of this bit of the meeting. And I presume everyone can hear me okay?
Can you hear? Increase the volume. So,
See if the mic can fit up here. Speakers on.
oh, it is. It should be. All right, John, can you give us another test?
Sure. Can you guys hear me now?
Okay. Go.
Okay.
Floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Hodenot. I'm a professor at Cornell University. I'm really sorry I can't be with you in person to discuss these super interesting papers. All three presenters have given us lots of interesting insights and things to talk about. What I'm going to do in my discussant notes is try and help set the broader scene for these papers, and second, provide some specific comments on each. In terms of an overview, I think everyone in this room is probably well aware and understands the definitions we use for household food security. They've been around for 30 or 40 years. They are basically well settled. It's also well understood that within those definitions, there are what the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization describes as the 4 pillars of food security, namely availability, which relates to supply, access, which relates to demand, utilization, which is a biological concept, and that of stability, which refers to food security over time. So these definitions and concepts have been around for a long time. I think we could argue that they are settled. But despite that, measurement continues to be challenging. We know that we can get a very good fix on household food security if we undertake a detailed household survey. But detailed household surveys are expensive, they're kind of clunky, they're time consuming, and you don't necessarily get the information quickly. This is deeply problematic because if we want to target assistance to those who are chronically or acutely or transitorily food insecure, we'd really like a simple measure that we can obtain quickly. Why is it that this is proving so difficult? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. A general observation is that we're trying to capture a latent construct. So I think Kathy Bayless mentioned in her presentation, there is no real gold standard against which we can actually benchmark the observation, the data or the variables that the data we collect are the variables that we construct. The second part is that the focus of these papers, the access component, is multifaceted. And that multifaceted nature makes it really hard to come up with a summary statistic. Underpinning these papers, either implicitly, or in the case of the paper presented by Dana Smith, explicitly, is a starting point that households hold assets, and that these assets play 2 roles. There's an income generation role, and there's a store of value role. These assets have a return. Assets by returns generate income, and then income is used to purchase food. And with this in mind, households are or become food insecure when they have few assets, or those assets are destroyed. Think, for example, of a flood or an earthquake, destroying assets that people hold. When the returns to assets are low, for example, in the context of a drought, we can think of the return to land being lowered by the absence of rainfall. But those returns to assets can be lowered during certain types of shocks for other reasons too. In Amartya Sen's famous example, people who work in rural areas but provide services, think of people, for example, like barbers, is that they are vulnerable to food insecurity during droughts because the demand for their services collapses. And finally, households can become food insecure when food prices rise. And there's either limited ability to substitute within the foods that people purchase, and households are net consumers as opposed to net producers of food. A third complexity is that food security is an intertemporal concept. In the definition, it's not only all people, but it's also at all times. But intertemporality can play out in complex ways. First, because assets play a role in income generation, as mentioned by, I think, a speaker in response to one of the first presentations, some households may, in quotation marks, prefer to smooth asset holdings rather than smooth consumption. Now, what are those households going to be? Well, households which are incredibly poor just don't have assets to begin with. So the idea that they can dispose of assets in response to a shock is just a non-starter. Households which are very rich might be able to use assets, particularly assets they hold for liquidity purposes. But households around certain types of thresholds, where the loss of that asset may have long-term effects on household ability to generate income, may prefer, again in quotation marks, to take the hit on food consumption rather than to actually sell off assets that they can't easily reacquire subsequently. On the other hand, anticipating, say, seasonal changes in prices, households might choose to stock up on assets when food prices are low. In the famous example by Durkheim and Krishnan, individuals build up body mass in periods of time when food prices are low and literally run down these stores when food prices are high. And the final point to note is that there are gradations in response to shocks and stresses that affect food security. As I think a couple of speakers mentioned, food security is not necessarily best seen as a binary state, but one where there are gradations of responses. And this is reflected in the measures that a number of the papers use. With that, and onto the papers themselves, I'm going to begin with the Smith et al. Paper. It has to be said, you guys have, looking at my notes, it's saying really, really cool data, okay? Monthly data on food security status collected in rural Malawi since 2018 that you use to address 3 questions around how variable is food insecurity over time, can we model this, and what are some of the policy implications of these models, particularly their forecasts. My suggestion for you guys is you go back and rethink the way in which you're characterizing food security and food security trends over time. And what struck me in particular was your initial descriptive statistics, where you show that 13% of households are always food secure, 0.4% are always food insecure, and the rest are households are the ones which switch back and forth. I don't think that categorization is actually really helpful for you guys, because a household that is only food insecure once is treated the same as a household that is only food insecure once is treated the same as a household that is only food secure once. It doesn't distinguish between households where food security is getting worse over time for those where food security is improving. So in other words, I could have the same count in terms of the number of periods of food insecurity, but be on very different trajectories. And of course, it doesn't account for the depths of food insecurity. So one place where I think you can look to improve on what you do here is to look at the literature on poverty spells, because that literature on poverty spells translates fairly readily to data to the idea of food insecurity or food insecurity spells. So for example, the Calvo-Durkheim measure of poverty spells could be linked to spells on food insecurity, which would allow you to address a number of the concerns I just described. On your fitting of fixed and stochastic factors, I think you draw on some of the ideas I described earlier. A couple of thoughts on your assets. It's slightly puzzling to me as why you don't include some measure of human capital or education status, is that would seem to be an important asset for some households. And I also wondered about the decision to have a binary variable on the whether or not you owned land as opposed to the amount of land you owned. Second, I wondered about how your prediction models address nonlinearities between assets and food security status. One of the challenges, I think, with this modeling is that food security status, in some sense, is doubly truncated. There is some limit below which your food security status or can't get any worse, but also some limit on which your food security status can't get any better. And certainly a linear relationship between those two doesn't work terribly well. And the third part, particularly relevant to your work in Malawi, is the fact that you have these very pronounced seasonal variations in food insecurity. My guess would be is if you fitted a model to household food security around or just after the time of harvest, those models wouldn't work terribly well. Okay, at that point in time, many households are going to be food secure. And following on from my earlier remarks, it may be a point in which in some sense households are trying to stock up, for example, in terms of trying to increase BMI. My suspicion is if you were to use your year's predictive models and predict out, that the correct starting point should not be the starting point where you collect your data, but actually the harvest period and then the 12 months after that. And my guess would be is the models would become better predictors as you move away from the harvest period. Final point is that I liked, and I thought was quite compelling, your slide you had on the asset quartiles. They look very consistent over time. Sorry, there's very little change in those over time, but that's not terribly surprising if you think of the assets which you hold in them. I would have really liked to have seen how your measure of food security status correlates within those asset quartiles. My guess is that you'd find that amongst those who are rich, there'd be relatively few instances or few spells of food insecurity, and much greater spells amongst those who are poorest. With that, I now want to move on to the Kathy Bayliss paper with colleagues. I really like the question you're asking in this paper. If we were to target food insecurity, if we wanted to target food insecure households, would it matter if we used the food consumption score, the reduced coping strategy index, or a measure of assets? Or should we look at the IPC type classifications? A further strength of the paper is that you look at rural areas, but you do so for a number of very different countries, allowing us to draw greater confidence, we hope, in the results you have. My concern with what you've done so far is I think some of the ways in which you're parsing the data are actually causing you difficulties. Most specifically, you use a cutoff for the food consumption score of 21. And I would suggest you use the higher cutoff, which is 35. 21 is actually an incredibly low number on that particular metric. To illustrate that at this point, if all I did over the course of a week is on a daily basis, consume some maize meal prepared with a little oil once a day, and I had a cup of tea once a day with a little bit of sugar in it, that would give me an FCS score of 21. I suspect part of the difficulty you're having in the predictions is by using such a low cutoff value, you just have very, very few households which then fall into that category. My suspicion is if you were to graph out the distribution of FCS, you'd see a much bigger mass of the distribution line between 21 and 35. And that, I think, would give you greater power to actually detect those households with lower borderline FCS rather than using the low cutoff itself. Relatedly, if you're using the reduced coping strategy index that I think you're using, it's worth noting in the first instance that with a recall period of 7 days, it's highly sensitive to seasonal fluctuations. Second, if you look at the weights which get ascribed to the questions within that index, the question, how many days has your household had to restrict consumption by adults in order for small children to eat because you did not have food or money to buy food? That question gives a lot of weight, but it only applies to households who have small children. So for example, within the RCSI, if you have, let's say, an elderly widow, ceteris paribus, they're going to score lower on that index than a household that does have small children. It's worth mentioning about that nutritionists will argue that the FCS captures quantities of food consumption, for which it's been validated, but not micronutrients or other measures of dietary quality. Economists tend to disagree and feel it captures both. Finally, it might be useful to think a little bit more about how your assets are constructed. For example, how do you adjust for land quality, which is going to be particularly important in some of the countries you work in. A half hectare of irrigated land might be more valuable in food security terms than 30 hectares of desert, that sort of thing. So adjusting for land quality might be helpful in some of the work you do. Methodologically, a more powerful approach might be for each country is to calculate asset quartiles, and then for each quartile, show the distribution of the FCS and the RCSIs and see how those distributions look relative to your cutoffs. And that might give you a better sense as to what extent there's correlation between the asset quartiles and there's food insecurity indices. Finally, on the paper that Travis very kindly stepped in to present, I'm going to be honest, guys, it was a little hard to work out exactly what you were doing from the slides themselves. So apologies, my notes here are going to be a little more brief. I think what really struck me about this, about your results is the following. First, although we would like in some way to get away from the idea of ground truthing or household surveys to collect data on food security status, one thing which has always been very valuable about that work is that it forces us to think about the issue of sample selection or self-selection into the sample. If we start off with an in-person survey, we can then follow up with phone data because we can reweight the data based on whether or not who doesn't have a phone. But it strikes me that for the targeting work that you did, I wasn't terribly surprised by the results. That in very poor circumstances, very poor countries, very poor people just simply don't have these phones. I also wasn't surprised about the sharing. In many countries, a long, long time ago, including the United States, people actually used to do that with landlines. In terms of the prediction models, I think the earlier points I made about these nonlinearities, I think is relevant here too. And of course, those nonlinearities don't exist to the same extent when you're correlating the CDR data with asset data more generally, which is why I suspect you do better in predicting one than you do the other. And a final point that I had been wondering about both before and during your presentation is this, is that when you guys talk about this targeting work, it seems to me that the emphasis is basically on individual level targeting. If we think about how we actually target in practice, and this would include, for example, the World Food Programme, often there's a multi-stage process where we target initially based on certain types of categories, which would include geographic locations. And then depending on what we think is going on within those localities, we may do a second cut of targeting, which is individual based. One of the things I wondered about is whether or not you could use the CDR data together with information on the availability of or the ownership of cell phones within geographic localities to actually improve on the first level categorical or geographic targeting. I suspect that might be, and more interestingly, whether or not, in fact, that also could prove to be a leading indicator of whether or not individuals in certain localities are beginning to experience stresses which are leading to food insecurity. So thinking about it, the targeting at both the geographic and individual level might give us greater purchase than what we have at the moment. But again, to sum, my congratulations to all three speakers for a series of very interesting and stimulating papers. And I think I speak for everyone in the room when I say we are looking forward to seeing the next versions of this work. Thank you very much.